Judy. Hi, everyone. There's an idea making the rounds in the working world, something called micro-retirement. And over the last month or two, it's been in the news and it's been analysed online. The idea is relatively simple. Instead of working flat out for ages until you retire, you take intentional breaks along the way, a couple of months every several years, to rest, to travel, spend time with family, or just reset your perspective before heading back to work again. They say it helps avoid burnout and keeps life balanced. Now, to some of you, that's going to sound very familiar because it's not entirely new. We used to call it long service leave, and before that it was something different entirely. And in some cases now, the most workaholic people have been slaving away so hard that they've gotten excited about rediscovering the concept of weekends. We live in a society that celebrates overwork. We wear busyness like a badge of honour. We often measure ourselves and likely each other by how many hours we put in, how many things we're juggling at any one time. And we often find ourselves with few to no quiet nights at home each week. It's almost as if stopping is seen as a sign of weakness. And so it is that every now and then we have to reinvent the wheel and rediscover the fact that we need rest. We're designed for it. We aren't made to work non-stop forever. From the very beginning of the Bible, long before HR departments and wellness retreats, God wove rest into the very fabric of life. Every week, every year, and even in the land itself, God gave humanity a rhythm to live by. Work, yes, but also trust. Stopping work in the way God instructs doesn't mean we are unfaithful or idle or lazy. Our rest is an act of faith. You see, our lives aren't held together by our own constant activity. They're held together by God's constant care. So when we rest, it isn't saying, I'll stop because I can't be bothered. Trust says, I will stop because God will keep his word. God sets it in place in Genesis 2, where it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." When Genesis tells us that God rested, it's not describing a tired creator who is completely knackered and really needs a nap. It's describing a God finding satisfaction in a completed work, a work that is described in Genesis 1:31 as very good. So God blesses the seventh day and makes it holy. But note that this blessing isn't linked to needing to be fruitful like the blessings on day 5 or 6. The blessing here is about the joy and satisfaction found in stopping, in resting. Rest is rooted in God's rhythm of creation, and it is a celebration of what's complete. Not only that, it is a holy space in time. It is time set apart. After God blessed work and rest in creation, we see that same principle play out centuries later in Israel's wilderness experience. God's people were freed from slavery in Egypt, stepping into a new life of dependence on God. And the desert that they fled into was harsh, with no easy food to be found. And yet God provided. In Exodus 16, he gave them manna, bread from heaven, every morning. However, it only appeared 6 days out of 7. On the 6th day, they gathered a double portion so that they would have enough for the Sabbath. And on the 7th day, there was no manna to be found. God was teaching them the rhythm he had built into creation. Trust him, stop striving, and rest. On other days, if they failed to trust him and hoarded the manna, it would spoil and grow worms. However, if they thought that that spoiling was a natural thing and failed to gather twice as much on the 6th day, Well, there wasn't any on the seventh. They had to follow God's instruction. Rest wasn't optional, and it wasn't laziness. It was an act of faith, and it was an act of trust, saying that we don't have to control the outcome, God provides. And after God's provision in this instance, he formalized it in the Sabbath command within the Ten Commandments. In Exodus 20, 8-11, God says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." He roots this rest in his example in creation. We are created in the image of God, and part of that image bearing is following his example for work. In Deuteronomy 5:15, God includes another layer to this. "You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." God represents this as a reminder of the fact that he brought them out of the slavery of Egypt. In those days of slavery, they would not have had any rest. Now they are to show faith in God's provision by stopping to have that rest and acknowledge him. And the Sabbath wasn't just for individuals and weekends. God even commanded Sabbath rest for the land itself. In Leviticus 25, verses 3-5, God stipulates that the land is to be left fallow for 1 year every 7 years. "For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land." No planting or harvesting. God would provide from the previous years and from the natural growth of the land itself. In fact, God goes further. After every 7 batches of 7 years, he calls for a Jubilee year. And included in the Jubilee year were many provisions too. Freeing slaves, returning land to its original tribe and owners. Truthfully, every 50th year was to be an extended year of trust in God. You are not to sow or reap in an organized way. God says that he would provide for them, giving them a bumper crop in the year preceding to allow them to eat all the way through the years of rest. How's that for a micro-retirement? It's not just a personal rest, but a national social rest. A reminder of the freedom they now had from the constant work of slavery in Egypt, and a reminder of God's reign and God's blessing. Their rest was an act of faith, an acknowledgement of the provision that God gave. And our rest should be too. If we're honest, most of us don't struggle to work. We struggle to stop. We fill our days, our nights, and our minds until there isn't really much room left. We either try to squeeze in time for God, or we try to squeeze things in around God. And unlike ancient Israel, we often don't have built-in rhythms to force us to slow down. The danger is that without rest, we start believing the lie that the world runs on our effort, and that everything will fall apart if we don't keep pushing. The Sabbath years and the Jubilee years confront that lie head on. They tell us that God is the one who sustains the harvest. It is God who cancels debts. It is God who sets captives free. The rest is not about being unproductive. It's about declaring in an incredibly clear way, God, you are in control, not me. In our world, that might not mean leaving fields unplanted for a year or handing back someone's farm. But it might mean refusing to answer work emails on your day off. It might mean carving out a Sunday that isn't church plus errands, but a real pause. It might even mean taking a proper break when you can, not just to recharge, but to remember who holds your life in his hands. We're not alone in our failure to rest, and there are consequences to that. Just after specifying the requirement for Sabbath years, Leviticus 26 gives the many consequences of failure to observe the rest as commanded. In verses 33 to 35 it says, "And I will scatter you among the nations, and I will unsheathe the sword after you, and your land shall be a desolation, and your cities shall be a waste. Then the land shall enjoy its Sabbaths as long as it lies desolate. While you are in your enemy's land, then the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbaths." The Israelites failed to follow many of God's instructions related to rest, and the prophets included these breaches in their rebukes. And they came to pass. 2 Chronicles 36, 20-21 says, "He took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years." The exile reminds us that rest is not optional. God's design for humanity, weekly Sabbath, Sabbath years, Jubilee, it was meant to shape lives and communities. To teach trust, mercy, dependence on God. When Israel ignored it, the consequences were profound. 70 years of forced rest for the land while they were in Babylon. The land lying desolate, the people reminded in no uncertain terms that God's rhythm cannot be lightly dismissed. But this story is not just about failure. It points forward. It shows humanity's deep need for someone who can live out perfect trust and rest, someone who can model what God intended from the beginning. And that someone is Jesus. In him the pattern is fulfilled, not just in law or ritual, but in life itself. Where Israel struggled to stop and trust, Jesus steps fully into the rhythm God designed. He withdraws to pray, he rests in the Father, and he invites us to share in that same restorative life. When we look at the life of Jesus, we see someone who knew how to stop. Even with crowds pressing in, sick people needing healing, disciples needing training, he would walk away to be alone with the Father. Mark 1:35 says, he would get up very early in the morning, while it was still dark, in order to be alone and pray. And we see frequently throughout the Gospels that he would withdraw to lonely places and pray. Jesus wasn't hiding from work. He was protecting the work. And rest wasn't laziness, it was preparation. And he invited others into that same kind of rest. Jesus says in Matthew 11:28-30, "Come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." And in Mark 2:27 to the Pharisees, he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Jesus tells us that rest, Sabbath rest, was made for man. That seventh day was always intended as a model for us, to follow as humanity, to reflect God's image, to declare God's creation. Note that Jesus doesn't just say, "Stop working." He says, "Come to me." In creation, God gave Adam work to do, tending to the Garden of Eden and naming the animals. Our lives should be a harmony between work and rest, but ultimately that balance comes in Christ. Jesus uses the analogy of a yoke. A yoke joins two animals together. Jesus isn't promising freedom from work entirely, but a new way of carrying life's load with him bearing the weight. The Pharisees of Jesus' day had made the yoke harder. They had heaped more rules and more regulations to attempt to fulfill that rest through human effort. However, in 1 Peter 5:6-7, we are called to cast all our anxieties on him, because he cares for us. The rest God built into creation, the Sabbath years, the Jubilee cycles, they aren't the end of the story. They are signposts pointing to something greater. Firstly, it points to the rest that comes from the free gift of salvation. In Ephesians 2, Paul writes, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them." We rest because our salvation isn't held together by our own human effort. It's not held together by our own constant activity. It's not held together by a bunch of many rules like the Pharisees had thought or brought. It's held together by God's hands, and both works and rest are gifts from God. Right now, we also live in an in-between time. We get glimpses of that rest when we trust God enough to stop striving, when we lay our burdens down, and when we come to Jesus. However, those moments are only a foretaste. The real thing is still ahead, a rest without interruption and no anxiety pulling us back to the grind, the only work that of God's. In the final chapters of the Bible, in Revelation, we see the world remade. No curse, no death, no struggle. The Lamb is on the throne, God's people are with him, and his work is complete. That's the ultimate Jubilee, the eternal freedom and joy God planned from the very beginning. We get to stop, we get to rest, we get to celebrate. We do still live in a culture that measures our worth by our output. We wear busyness like a badge of honor, but God's story tells us something radically different. Your value is not in what you produce, it's in whose you are. And rest isn't wasted time, it's worship, it's trust. It's an act of that trust, saying, God, you're in control, and I'm not. It's not my effort, but yours. I want to give you guys a challenge. First, guard a day each week to stop, worship, and delight in God. Not just an effort to recover energy for more work, but to actually remind yourself that the world runs just fine without you. Take a daily rest, even if it's just 10 minutes, to stop, to breathe, and to be with God, just like Jesus did. Practice small jubilees. Forgive debts. Let go of grudges. Free yourself and others from unnecessary burdens. And pay attention to your heart. If you can't stop working, ask yourself what you're afraid will happen if you do. And ask yourself if God is really incapable of doing that for you. One day the work will be over. And when it is, we'll step into the final rest that God's been pointing us toward since the very first sunset. Until then, every pause, every Sabbath, every moment of trust is a rehearsal for eternity. Thank you.